Okay,
So where do you want me to start from?
Let's
Detroit?
start from the beginning in Detroit. Just very briefly summarize your father's history and his impact on the African cultural restoration movement.
Okay. His Royal Majesty, Oba Adefunmi, was born Walter Eugene King in Black Bottom, Detroit in 1928. His father was a part of the Marcus Garvey movement. They sold their family furniture store to buy shares in the company. And early on, young Serge, if you will, or young Walter learned that up you mighty race, you can achieve what you will. And from that day on, he sought to find the spirituality of African people so that he could, that can be used as a vehicle to uplift the people, just like Marcus Garvey always said. And so moving forward, His Highness discovered that his mission in life was to restore the culture of Africa approximately at the age of 14. He joined the Catherine Dunham dance troupe and traveled to Haiti.
Was he a dancer already?
No, was not a dancer. He took up modeling, posing and modeling and drafting at the Detroit Urban League. And of course he took up drafting as commercial architecture, commercial art at Cass Tech here in Detroit. And then he traveled to Haiti in 1948, I believe. He was 20 years old. And then the next year he traveled to Egypt. And that's when he was opened up to the solid forms, or to the meat and potatoes of African culture and religion. And once he realized that it did exist and it was just as ancient as everything else, he came back to the United States, fired up, and joined some organizations, the various organizations to promote African culture. The Pioneer Movement, and he also joined the Republic of New Africa.
Carlos Cook's movement. He was part of that.
Yes, he was part of that movement with Carlos Cooks and the African Pioneer Movement, which they disassembled further down the road, of course, but it was just a family squabble going forward. And then he traveled to Cuba after meeting a Puerto Rican friend who had friends in Cuba, traveled to Cuba in 1959, and became initiated or ordained in African spirituality. Returning to the U.S., fired up once again. I mean, this time he had to be really fired up because he started creating African clothes, opened up African markets, gave people African names, giving people the traditional African beads. And of course, the people who sent him to Cuba, the African Spanish-speaking people, really didn't like the fact that Adefunmi was spreading his culture far and wide, because it was supposed to be sort of like a Cosa Nostra, or something that is extremely for us. You know, something that is closed off, but he opened it up, opened the avenues to all black people. And so they told him, they said, look, you can be initiated into this culture. You're kind of light-skinned like us, we know you're probably like one of us anyway. You're not really a black guy, so to speak. So let me tell you something. Don't give this culture, this religion to the black Americans, because they won't understand it. And that fueled him even further to go out and recruit African people, bring them in and have them be a part of this particular movement. And there was one attempt on his life. We're not sure how it conspired or who was responsible for it, but nonetheless, it was seen to be one of those things that His Majesty was not giving away, but putting on the world stage this African tradition that many wanted to keep clandestine and under wraps. And so he went forward despite all of the criticism and despite all of the backbiting and infighting. He went on to move to South Carolina to open up and establish a community whereby the worship, the preservation of African traditional culture and religion could take place. So they opened up on approximately 5 or 6 acres of country property or heirs property in South Carolina, and they began to build huts and houses, make babies. The children ran on the property. They had wells. They just totally off the grid. And then, of course, further down the line, a few years later, they were ejected from that piece of property. So they had to tear down their homes and move board by board about 4 miles to the new site that they had purchased. And of course, once they moved to that low country area in South Carolina, the local people are so African still that they looked out for them. They said, look, Serge, you got a problem with that land? Come over here. I got another piece of land I could sell you. And so they sold him a piece of property for approximately $500 at the time. And some of that was food stamps and people's life savings and nickels and dimes and quarters. And he purchased the land and began to build the Oyotunji community as it stands today. And so today, Oyotunji stands as a monastery. And that was His Majesty's vision, was that this African village would be a monastery whereby all African people and descendants, people who can trace their lineage to Africa post-slave trade and all of that, can come and learn how their people lived, what made their people great, how their people lived without jails, how their people lived without old folks' homes, and how they lived without juvenile homes and all of these social services that we have today. And so Oyotunji stands today as a monastery and a monument to Africans in this country. Name one monument built to African ancestors in this country that speaks to who they were. Not like something that somebody made to try to talk about the entire slave trade, but something that speaks exactly to who those people were. And so Oyotunji is that monument here in the United States that was built by African Americans from across the United States, and it still stands today as a crucible of African culture, and it is a cultural edifice. It seems imposing sometimes because most African things are imposing to Western society, but we continue to raise families. We have a strong gardening component today as part of the reason why we're in Detroit now. We are going into sustainable building, and so we're going to be taking up some different areas, techniques of sustainability to move us forward in the future and keep us relevant to the times, and let people know that African people and African culture can sustain me.
Chief Olaitan, would you add your perspective to this?
I would love to do so. It's not an accident that while the movement was going on cultural restoration, that Oba Adefunmi I was kind of, even though it was spreading in the cultural world, it was largely hidden from the general population. While that was going on, the Nation of Islam was expanding by leaps and bounds. The civil rights, quote unquote, movement was expanding by leaps and bounds. And Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad were in the news all of the time. King Adefunmi was not. I mean, every so often there would be newspaper articles. There were articles in Jet and Ebony and Sepia and magazines like that, but it was largely seen as a very bizarre or exotic or strange, occultish kind of movement. But if we look at the long-lasting impact on the cultural restoration or the cultural redemption movement as how it applies to Africans today, that people have changed their mindset. So what Oba Adefunmi brought back to the African born in America was a different psychology, a different sociology, a different worldview. Because up until that point in time, for someone to mention God and Africa in the same breath was seen as either they were out of their mind or they were blasphemous. That Africa didn't have any gods. It was called the Black Continent. But with the return of the deities of Africa also came with them a philosophy that Africa was the center of the world, a psychology that says we can be our own men and women and view the world through African eyes. Our own sociology. How do we bring children in the world? How do we name them? How do we set them up and teach them in school? How do we then send them through their puberty rites of passage? Because at that age, that is a critical age and stage in a person's life and development. So young boys who come into that age grade, then they must be taught, trained, guided to learn how to hunt, how to fish, how to sew, how to make something with their hands, how to be able to be secure enough to sleep in the woods by yourself, how to identify indigenous wild vegetation and what the medicinal uses are for, and all of those types of things, and develop and have good character. All of that is within the cultural milieu or the cultural architecture, and that is what Oba Adefunmi brought back when he decided to go to Matanzas, Cuba, and get initiated August 26, 1959, and bring that back with him. May not have even realized it at the time himself, but when he really got into it, or when the ASHE or the Orisha got into him, then all of this came back out. And this has been largely hidden up until the founding of Oyotunji, I would think. Then it began these institutions, because Oba Adefunmi says that it must live beyond me, even though a king never dies. But at the same time, it must not be personality based. It must be institution based. So institutions were established at Oyotunji: Men's Society, Women's Society, Public Works Society, artist guilds, craft guilds, business guilds, the various priesthood guilds and temples. So all of these institutions have been established. And Oba Adefunmi said that it'll take 100 years before this becomes fully functioning and a smooth operating organization in the sense of cultural restoration movement. We're from 1959 till now, 50 some years in, 53, 54 years in. So we're a little over halfway, and we're seeing the impact of it on our people throughout America and the world. Because even in Africa, the Africans were throwing their culture away hand over fist. Oh, we don't want that. That's old. That's not any good for us anymore. We'll claim another spiritual tradition. And that is what has us in our situation now, and that is what have them in their situation. In West Africa, Nigeria is an example. They are one of the largest producers of oil in the world. I think 6th. They don't refine any of their oil, so they have to ship it out somewhere in Europe and whatnot, and then have it refined and then brought back into their own country where it was pumped out of the ground. The companies that they allow to pump this oil out of the ground use or misuse the natural gas that comes out of the well, which is part of it, and rather than it being bottled, it's easier for that company to just set a match to it and fire it up, and it's destroying the environment in that country in which this oil is coming out of. Rather than being able to produce enough electricity for their country, in Nigeria you get about 6 hours of electricity a day. So the grid is down the majority of the time, 3/4 of the time the grid is up. And that, to me, does not make sense. So, because they have turned their back on their ancestors, is our point of view, and this is our opinion, is some of the reason that the situation that exists in most African nations is existing today. Because if you then turn your back on a relative or someone who you should be helping, and your ancestors whose shoulder that we stand upon, if you've turned your back on them and claim another's ancestors, and what do you think your ancestors are going to think of you? So Oba Adefunmi brought to us the concept of ancestral veneration, a psychology that's put our own ancestors and deities, reflects back to us from the cosmos, that we look at the world from an African perspective, and we build our world from that worldview that we are the progenitors of this humanity, and we should then work to resolve those issues that we have within our community, and not let another's perspective and point of view and psychology and sociology and philosophy then dictate to us how and who and what we are and how we will deal with our concerns and issues.